The sound of rain brushed gently against the window, filling the quiet house with a rhythm that seemed almost comforting, and yet, for Daniel, it only deepened the silence. It had been nearly 2 years since he moved back to his hometown, hoping that being closer to his mother would make things feel lighter. But some silences don't fade, even with time. The echoes of laughter that once filled this house were gone. His father's voice, once warm and steady, existed only in memory now. Every evening, Daniel would come home from work, set his keys on the same wooden table, and heat up dinner for one. The television would flicker softly in the background, but he barely noticed it. What he did notice was the quietan endless. Heavy quiet that seemed to whisper everything he'd lost. Sometimes he thought about calling his mother. Grace lived only 30 minutes away, in the same little house where he grew up. She was a woman of strength and calm, the kind who smiled through her sorrow. But lately, even her voice had changed. It carried the sound of years that had weighed too heavily. Still, Daniel hesitated. Not because he didn't love her, but because every time they talked, he could hear his father's absence between their words. It was like standing in a room full of memories you can't touch. That night, something felt different. Maybe it was the way the rain fell heavier than usual. Or maybe it was the ache that had grown too loud to ignore. He stood by the window, watching the reflection of streetlights shimmer across puddles. He could almost hear his father saying, "Don't let time steal the people you love." The words came back to him from years ago, spoken during one of their summer trips to the lake. Back then, life felt simpler. His parents had been in love for 30 years, the kind of love that showed in the smallest ways. His dad bringing his mom her morning tea, or her fixing his scarf before he went out in the cold. Daniel used to think love like that was forever. But forever ended too soon. He took out his phone and scrolled to his mother's number. His thumb hovered over the call button. For a moment he almost put it away, but then something inside him whispered, "Do it." The phone rang twice before Grace answered. "Danny." Her voice came, warm but tired. "Hey, Mom, did I wake you?" No, I was just reading. It's good to hear your voice." There was a pause, a small one but enough for Daniel to hear what wasn't said. She missed him. And maybe she needed something to hold on to as much as he did. He smiled faintly. "Mom, how would you feel about a trip?" "A trip?" she repeated, surprised. "Yeah, just a little family trip. You and me." There was silence again, this time longer. Then he heard the soft laugh he hadn't heard in months. "You? Planning a trip? That's a first." Daniel chuckled. "I figured it's about time. Where are we going?" she asked. He looked out the window again, watching the rain fade into a soft mist. "It's a surprise," he said quietly. Grace didn't press further. "All right then," she said. "I trust you." After they hung up, Daniel leaned back against the wall, staring into the dim light of the living room. He had made the decision without fully knowing why. Maybe it was guilt. He had been distant for too long. Maybe it was love, the kind that only grows deeper when you realize time is fragile. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something he hadn't told her yet. As he packed his bag later that night, he placed one thing carefully on top of his clothes: a small wooden box. Inside it were old photographs, a folded letter, and a ring that once belonged to his father. He held the ring for a long moment, feeling its weight. "This trip's for you too." "Dad," he whispered. Meanwhile, across town, Grace sat in her armchair, staring at the phone. Her son's voice still lingered in her mind, warm and familiar. For years she had learned to live with the quiet, to fill her days with books, gardening, and the company of her old cat. But the nights were hardest. Nights were when she remembered everything: the laughter, the songs her husband used to hum, and the way Daniel would run into her arms after school. She stood and walked to the window. The rain had stopped, and the sky had cleared just enough for a sliver of moonlight to rest across the old family photo on the shelf. Her husband, smiling with his arm around her. Daniel, no older than 6. His grin wide and bright dot. Grace touched the frame gently. "Maybe it's time," she whispered. When she went to pack her bag, she didn't know what to expect. A weekend trip. A short drive to the countryside. She didn't care. The thought of spending time with her son again was enough. But somewhere deep down, a quiet feeling stirred one she hadn't felt in years. Hope, as the clock ticked toward midnight. The house felt less empty. She smiled to herself, closing her suitcase and placing it by the door. Across town. Daniel turned off the lights, the faint glow of his phone screen fading into darkness. He didn't know what the trip would bring, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just a vacation. It was a chance to heal. And maybe, just maybe, a chance to give his mother the one thing she'd lost. A reason to smile again. The morning sun crept through the blinds of Daniel's small apartment, casting soft gold lines across the floor. The air smelled faintly of coffee and rain-soaked earth. He had barely slept that night, his mind circling around memories he thought he had neatly tucked away years ago. He sat at the table, stirring his coffee long after it had cooled. His suitcase stood by the door, packed and ready. Tomorrow, he and his mother would leave for their trip, the first one since his father passed. But as the quiet filled the room, so did the memories. He remembered how it used to be, the three of them at the lake every summer. His father teaching him how to skip stones, while his mother sat on the porch, sketching the trees in her little notebook. Daniel used to run barefoot through the grass, his laughter echoing down the hill. Life was simple then, safe. Hold on, there was one summer that always stood out. The last one before everything changed. He had been 16. His father, already sick, refused to let the illness steal their time together. He insisted on one final trip to the cabin. Grace had packed sandwiches, lemonade, and her sketchbook. They drove 4 hours, the radio playing softly, his father humming along to old songs. Daniel could still remember his mother's hand resting gently on her husband's knee, the silent comfort between them. That was the summer Daniel learned what love really looked like, not in grand gestures, but in quiet devotion, in the way his mother brushed the leaves from his father's hair as he napped under the trees, in the way his father smiled at her even when words became hard to find out. Years later, those memories felt like photographs in his mind, soft-edged and fading, but alive. He wondered if his mother remembered them the same way, across town. Grace stood in her kitchen, packing sandwiches just like she used to. The motion felt familiar, almost sacred, as though repeating an old rhythm. It could bring back the warmth of those days. As she layered the bread and wrapped each sandwich neatly, her thoughts wandered back to the same summer Daniel was remembering. She could still see her husband's face in the sunlight, still feel the wind from the lake on her skin. She remembered Daniel's laughter, loud, unguarded, and full of life. And she remembered the moment her husband had quietly taken her hand and said, "Promise me, Grace, when I'm gone, don't let him lose his joy." She had promised. But promises are easy to make and hard to keep when grief takes root. After he passed, she and Daniel had tried to be strong for each other. But somehow that strength had become distance. Conversations turned short. Visits became rare. They spoke, but not deeply. They were together, but not close. Grace had always sensed the unspoken guilt in Daniel, as if he carried some weight. He didn't need to. Maybe it was because he had been the one to drive his father to the hospital that final night. Maybe because, at 16, he had to grow up too fast now. As she zipped her small travel bag, Grace wondered if this trip was Daniel's way of finding peace. Or maybe giving her a piece of the peace she had lost. When Daniel arrived at her house that evening, the sky was painted in hues of pink and gold. Grace opened the door before he could knock. "Double quotes, hi, Mom," he said, smiling gently. "Hi, sweetheart. Come in." Her living room looked exactly the same. Soft beige walls, family photos, a faint scent of lavender. Daniel's eyes lingered on the old photograph above the fireplace, his parents on their wedding day. His father in a gray suit, smiling like the world belonged to him. And his mother glowing beside him. "You never changed a thing," he said softly. Grace followed his gaze. "Some things shouldn't be changed," she replied. They shared a quiet moment, the kind that says everything words can't. After dinner, they sat by the window, watching the last bit of daylight fade. Grace poured them both tea, just like she always did. "So," she said, a hint of curiosity in her voice, Where are we going? Really? Daniel smiled, shaking his head. Still a surprise. She laughed, her eyes sparkling in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. You sound just like your father when you do that. He looked down at his cup, a lump forming in his throat. Yeah, he said quietly. I've been thinking about him a lot lately. Grace nodded, her voice tender. He'd be happy to know that. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The clock ticked softly, and the smell of tea leaves filled the room. Then Daniel spoke again, almost to himself. I want us to have something good again. Something like before. Grace turned toward him, her eyes warm but sad. We already do. The morning arrived with a soft chill in the air, the kind that carried both freshness and memory. The road stretched before them like a ribbon of silver, winding through forests that glowed with the colors of late autumn. Grace sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the windows slightly open to let in the crisp breeze. Daniel drove quietly beside her, the radio humming old melodies that seemed to fill the silence with something peaceful. It had been years since they'd spent this much time together, just the two of them. No calls interrupting, no schedules rushing them, just miles of open road and the quiet sound of belonging. Do you remember the last time we took this road? Grace asked suddenly. Daniel glanced at her. The summer before I left for college, he said. She smiled faintly. You were so excited. You couldn't stop talking about how you were finally going to live on your own. I was trying to sound brave, Daniel admitted with a soft laugh. But the truth is, I was terrified. Grace looked at him gently. You never showed it. Dad always said I didn't have to, Daniel replied. He said courage doesn't mean not being afraid. It means loving something enough to face the fear anyway. Grace's eyes glistened as she looked out the window. That sounds like him. For a while they drove in silence, the sound of the wind and tires on the road filling the spaces between them. But something about the drive felt different, lighter somehow, as if the memories they carried were no longer weights, but wings by noon. They stopped at a small roadside cafe, the kind of place that looked as though it hadn't changed in 30 years. The walls were lined with black and white photos of travelers and families, and the smell of freshly baked pie drifted through the air. Grace smiled as she stepped inside. Would you look at this place? It feels like we've been here before. Daniel looked around. The wooden booths, the old jukebox in the corner. It did feel strangely familiar. Then it hit him. Mom, he said softly, we have been here. You and Dad brought me here once. I think I was about 10. Grace's eyes widened and a small laugh escaped her. That's right. You insisted on ordering every flavor of ice cream they had. Daniel laughed too. And Dad actually let me. The waitress, a kind woman with silver hair, overheard them and smiled. You two look like you've got a lot of good memories tied to this place. Grace nodded. More than we realized. They ordered coffee and pie, apple for her, blueberry for him, and as they talked, something began to shift. The laughter came easier, the words flowed more freely. Grace watched her son as he spoke about his work, his quiet life, and the plans he rarely shared with anyone. She noticed how much he had grown, not just older, but steadier, more thoughtful. For Daniel, seeing his mother smile again felt like watching the sun rise after a long winter. There was warmth in it, but also something fragile, like hope rediscovering its strength. When they finished their meal, the waitress brought the bill along with a small note written on a napkin. It read, Sometimes the road takes us exactly where we need to remember. Grace looked at Daniel, her eyes soft with surprise. Did you tell her about us? He shook his head. No, they both fell quiet, staring at the message. It felt almost like the universe had whispered something only they could understand. By late afternoon, they reached the lake. The air was cool, the surface of the water glimmering under the pale sun. The cabin stood at the edge of the trees, its wooden frame weathered but strong. Grace froze when she saw it. Her breath caught in her chest. Daniel? She whispered, her voice trembling. You didn't? He smiled faintly. Welcome back, Mom. Her eyes filled instantly. Every sound, the wind through the branches, the gentle lap of the lake, brought back a flood of memories. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing against the wooden door. You fixed it, she said softly. It looks exactly how it used to. Daniel nodded. I've been coming up here on weekends, cleaning, repairing, remembering. Grace turned to him, her eyes shimmering. All this time. Yeah, he said. I guess I needed to feel close to him again. To both of you. She took a deep breath, the smell of pine and earth filling her lungs. Oh, Daniel, she whispered. You brought him back to me. Inside the cabin, everything looked untouched by time. The old fireplace, the framed photo of their family still on the mantel, and the creaky floorboards that sang with every step. Grace ran her hand along the back of the old couch. Your father and I sat here for hours, talking about nothing and everything. Daniel smiled. I remember, you used to fall asleep while he read the newspaper out loud. She laughed softly. He had the most serious voice when he read. Even the comic strips sounded important. They both laughed. But beneath it, the air was thick with emotion, the kind that sits in your chest and refuses to fade. Then, as Grace turned toward the window, something caught her eye. On the table sat a small envelope with her name written on it in her husband's handwriting. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. Daniel, what is this? He looked at her, his voice quiet. I found it in one of Dad's old toolboxes when I was fixing the cabin. I thought, maybe you should be the one to open it. Grace's eyes filled with tears before she even unfolded the paper. The familiar handwriting blurred as she read the words, a message written years ago, yet perfectly timed for this moment. My Grace, if you're reading this, it means life has moved on, but my love never will. Take care of our boy, and when the time feels right, come back to the lake. You'll find me in the wind, in the trees, and in his eyes, always. Her voice broke as she whispered the last line aloud. Daniel reached for her hand, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind swept across the lake, and the water rippled gently as though echoing the letter's final promise for Grace. It felt as if time had folded in on itself, bringing the past and present together. For Daniel, it was the first time in years that he saw peace in his mother's eyes, and in that quiet cabin, surrounded by memory and love, both of them knew the trip was only beginning. The night came quietly to the lake, wrapping the cabin in silver moonlight. The fire inside burned low, soft crackle filling the silence between Daniel and Grace. Neither of them spoke for a while. The letter from his father still rested on the table, the paper faintly trembling from the breeze that slipped through a half-open window. Grace sat in her old armchair, her eyes fixed on the flames. Every line of the letter replayed in her mind. The words, you'll find me in the wind, in the trees. And in his eyes kept echoing, gentle, unending. Daniel watched her quietly from the couch. He wanted to say something comforting. Something that would lift the heaviness in the air, but words felt too small. So he waited, letting the silence speak for them both. After a long while, Grace finally broke it. He always knew, she said softly. He knew how to say goodbye before any of us were ready. Daniel leaned forward. He did. Her voice trembled. He asked me to be strong for you, but I wasn't. I tried, Daniel, but I wasn't. He shook his head gently. Mom, you don't have to say that. You were everything I needed. She looked at him, her eyes glassy with tears. Then why did we grow apart? Daniel lowered his gaze. The question hung in the air, heavier than the silence before it. He had asked himself that same question countless times. Why two people who loved each other so deeply could drift so far apart. I think we both tried to protect each other, he said finally. You didn't want me to see your pain, and I didn't want to add to it. Grace nodded slowly. Maybe we forgot that love isn't just about protecting. It's about sharing the hurt, too. The fire popped softly, sending tiny sparks into the air. I missed you, Daniel said quietly. Grace's lips trembled into a faint smile. I missed you too, every single day. For a long time, they sat together, speaking only through the silence that had once separated them. The air between them felt lighter now, though neither could say exactly why. Perhaps it was because they had finally acknowledged what had always been there. It's the unspoken truth that grief had kept them apart. Not lack of love. After a while, Grace stood and walked to the old piano by the window. Dust covered the keys, but it still looked as elegant as ever. You remember this? She asked. Daniel smiled faintly. How could I forget? You used to make me sit next to you and hum along until I fell asleep. She laughed softly. And you always sang off key. I still do, he said. Grace pressed one key, then another. The sound was faint but clear. She began to play a melody Daniel recognized instantly, the song his father used to hum every evening by the fire. It was slow, simple, and full of ache. Daniel closed his eyes, letting the notes carry him. He saw flashes of the past, his father sitting on the porch, the glow of lanterns, his mother's laughter in the dusk. The sound filled the cabin like a memory reborn. When Grace finished, she looked down at the keys and whispered, I used to think I'd never be able to play this again. Daniel's voice was soft. What changed? She turned toward him, her eyes warm but steady. You did. For a heartbeat, he didn't know what to say. Then he simply nodded. The quiet that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful, almost sacred. Later that evening, they stepped outside. The night air was cool, and the lake shimmered under the moon. The sky stretched endlessly above them, scattered with stars. Grace wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. It's strange, she said, how this place never changes. And yet, it feels different now. Tea. The morning after their long conversation came softly, carried on a pale gold light that spilled through the cabin windows. The world outside was still covered in dew and quiet mist. Daniel awoke to the sound of birds beyond the lake, gentle, rhythmic. Like the first breath of something new, he sat on the edge of his bed, his thoughts restless. The night before had been full of truths, small, painful, and freeing all at once. Yet one thing still lingered inside him, unspoken. A truth that had been building for years, pressing at the edges of his silence. He knew that before he could move forward. Before either of them could truly heal, he had to say it. Grace was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared breakfast. The scent of coffee drifted through the air. She looked peaceful, her shoulders finally relaxed. Daniel watched her for a moment, remembering the countless mornings just like this sex-apt back then. There had always been someone else in the chair by the window. His father's laughter still seemed to echo faintly there, like a shadow of memory. Good morning, Grace said, turning toward him with a small smile. You were up early. Couldn't sleep much, he replied, his voice low but calm. Too many thoughts. She guessed. Daniel smiled faintly. Something like that? She poured him a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. For a few moments they simply ate in silence. But Daniel's mind was far from the table. It was in the past, the years between them. The things never said. Finally, he set his cup down and spoke quietly. Mom, there's something I need to tell you. Grace looked up, concern flickering in her eyes. What is it? He took a breath, steadying himself. For a long time, I blamed you. Her eyes widened slightly. Blamed me. Daniel nodded, his tone gentle but sure. When Dad passed away, I didn't understand why everything changed. Why you shut down. I was angry. Not just at losing him, but at losing you too. Grace's lips parted slightly, but she didn't interrupt. Daniel continued. I thought maybe you didn't love him enough to keep going. Or maybe you didn't love me enough to stay the same. His voice cracked. But I was wrong. I see that now. You weren't weak, Mom. You were just grieving in your own way. I didn't understand then, but I do now. Tears filled Grace's eyes before she could stop them. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, as if trying to hold in years of emotion. Oh, Daniel, she whispered. I never wanted you to feel that way. Not for a single moment. I know, he said softly, but I needed to say it. I needed you to know that I forgive you. And I need you to forgive me too for walking away, for not calling, for building this wall between us. Grace's tears fell freely now. She stood slowly and came around the table. Daniel rose to meet her. She reached for his face, cupping it gently in her hands. There's nothing to forgive, she said, her voice trembling but full of love. You were hurting too. We both were. I should have seen it sooner. Daniel closed his eyes, his own tears slipping free. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel everything: anger, sorrow, love, relief, all tangled together. It was overwhelming, but it was real. In that moment, something within them broke, not in destruction, but in release. The years of silence, guilt, and distance finally shattered under the weight of truth. Grace pulled him into an embrace. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was quiet and long, the kind that spoke more than words ever could. She held her son the way she had when he was a boy, fiercely, protectively, as if love itself could keep time from moving forward. When they finally stepped back, both were smiling through tears. I've missed this, Grace said softly. So have I, Daniel replied. They spent the afternoon by the lake, sitting on the weathered dock where his father used to fish. The water shimmered beneath a clear sky, reflecting the sunlight like glass. Grace dipped her hand into the water, watching the ripples spread outward. It's funny, she said after a while. I used to come here and ask him for signs. Little things like a gust of wind or a bird landing nearby. I wanted to believe he was still watching us. Daniel smiled gently. Maybe he was. She turned to him. Do you believe that? He nodded. I didn't before, but I do now. Not because I've seen anything, but because I feel it. Every time I'm here, it's like he's still part of this place. Part of us. Grace's eyes softened. Maybe that's what love really is. Doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. Daniel thought about that for a moment. Then he said quietly, I think he'd be happy to see us like this. Grace smiled faintly. I think so too. As the sun began to dip below the trees, Daniel stood and looked out at the glowing horizon. He felt lighter, like something had finally lifted from his shoulders. The truth had been painful, but it had also set him free. Grace joined him, her hand resting gently on his arm. Thank you, she said. For what? For coming back. For talking to me. For reminding me that it's never too late. Daniel smiled. It's never too late, Mom. Not for us. The last of the sunlight bathed the lake in amber and gold. They stood there quietly, mother and son, bound not by regret anymore, but by understanding. The silence between them wasn't empty, now it was peaceful, full of unspoken forgiveness and love that no words could measure. The turning point hadn't come from grand gestures or perfect timing. It had come from something far simpler, the courage to speak their truth. And the grace to listen. The morning air at the lake was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and water. Daniel and Grace stood on the dock, their breath visible in the soft sunlight, each lost in quiet thought. The cabin behind them felt alive again, filled with the echoes of laughter, conversation, and memories that were no longer trapped in the past. For years, the weight of grief and distance had hung over them like a shadow. But now, after days of shared stories, gentle apologies, and long silences filled with understanding, something new had begun, a sense of peace neither had expected. Grace took a deep breath, looking out across the water. It feels like the lake has been waiting for us, she said softly. Daniel smiled. Maybe it has. Maybe it was waiting for us to remember that love never really leaves. She turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. It's strange how long it took us to realize that. How long it took to just be here together, fully present. Daniel nodded. We were both holding on to the past, afraid to move forward. But I think now we finally understand it. The sun climbed higher, casting golden reflections across the gentle ripples of the lake. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wooden box that had traveled with him all week. He handed it to his mother. "Open it," he said quietly. Grace did, revealing the old photographs, the letters, and the small ring that had belonged to her husband. She traced her fingers over the items, remembering each moment, the smiles, the quiet afternoons, the love that had shaped their lives. He would be proud, she whispered. Daniel took her hand in his. "Not just him. I'm proud of us. We didn't lose each other, Mom. We just lost our way for a little while." Grace smiled, the kind of smile that reaches the eyes and the heart at the same time. "I think this trip was meant for that, to remind us of what really matters." They spent the day exploring the area around the cabin, walking along familiar trails that had once been full of childhood memories. The air was alive with the colors of late autumn amber leaves drifting lazily to the ground, the wind carrying the distant laughter of birds. As they paused at the edge of a clearing, Grace looked at Daniel. "Do you remember when your father used to bring us here for picnics?" He nodded, smiling. "I remember him making sandwiches and insisting that we taste everything he packed." Grace laughed softly. "And you always wanted the largest portion of everything. He never said no, even though he knew you'd complain about it later." Daniel chuckled. "I guess some things never change." They sat on a fallen log, letting the quiet settle around them. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, of forgiveness, and of love that had been waiting patiently for this moment. "I never realized," Grace said after a while, "that healing could feel like this. Gentle, quiet, and steady. I thought it would hurt forever." Daniel reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It can hurt forever if you let it. But we didn't. We chose to face it together." For the first time in years, the lake seemed to reflect not just their memories, but their hope. Grace felt lighter, her heart unburdened by guilt and regret. Daniel felt a calm he hadn't known he could feel, free from the weight of unspoken words and lost time. As the day turned into evening, they returned to the cabin. The fire was lit once more, casting a warm glow that filled the room with light and comfort. Daniel poured them both a cup of tea, and they sat together in companionable silence, watching the flames dance. Grace spoke softly, almost to herself. "You know, I think your father would be happy to see us like this. Not just surviving, but living. Really living." Daniel nodded. "I think so too. And I think he'd want us to remember that love isn't just about what we lose, it's about what we hold on to and carry forward." Grace reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll always have that, no matter what comes next." As the night settled over the lake, the stars began to shine faintly in the clear sky. Daniel and Grace stood on the porch together, looking out at the calm water, their hearts light and their bond stronger than it had been in years. They had come on this trip to remember the past, but they had found something more: peace, understanding, and the quiet joy. "Oh,